Well, it's just the three of us.
Just the three of us.
We can make a podcast if we try.
Building podcasts in the sky.
Just the three of us. You and I.
Beautiful.
Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your host, Sean Hartman, author of the new clickbait article, Secretly Honkin' on Bobo, 15 Celebrities You Didn't Know Played Harmonica, from Rod Stewart to Bruce Willis.
There's something perverse about that title.
Oh, really?
Unintentional, I'm sure.
Well, I'm co-host Jeremy, and I just wanted to say, if you want our podcast and you think it's spiffy, come on, listener, tell us so. If you really need us, just reach out and email. Come on, listener, tell us so.
Wow. Listener, that email is I'd buy that podcast at gmail.com if you want to take Jeremy up on that.
That was me trying to do a Peter. Did I do okay?
You did well.
I was just waiting for you to work in a please rate, review, and subscribe into the lyrics, but
Yeah, that's why Peter's the man and I'm just the mimic.
well, it was a valiant effort.
Thank you.
Man versus Mimic. Well, I am co-host Peter Cook, and I did not have time to come up with a clever fake intro for this episode because half of my research time for this episode was figuring out where the record was housed in the jacket of this Rod Stewart Never a Dull Moment album. It's one of the most unusual, complicated jackets I've ever encountered on a mainstream release. He had some innovative jackets. Have either of you handled a physical copy of this album?
Yes, and I can't blame you for the massive time sink. It can be strangely confusing.
Yeah, I remember when I first got it a while back being confused, and it did not fail to do that to me again when I was preparing for this episode. I don't even know how to, I tried to come up with a way to describe it, and I was unsuccessful in that too. So listeners will just have to get their hands on a copy and find out for themselves. There's never a dull moment when you're trying to find the album, the record inside of this jacket.
A Rubik's jacket.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle. So yeah, we've pretty much given away what we're talking about on this. This is our first episode of the new year, 2025.
Yeah. Does it feel different to you guys? Do you have a renewed vision, hope for the future? Are you feeling rested, ready to take on the rest of the season?
I'm older and wiser, so yes.
All right, that's a start.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Jeremy had a birthday over the holiday break. Happy birthday, Jeremy.
Thank you. I spent it in my house sick. It's a very cool
No,
birthday.
I'm so sorry that we did not get to do the rendezvous at Olive Garden as you had invited us to.
Next time.
Well, I've been spending the last week and a half sick in solidarity and also in celebration of your birthday. So you're welcome. Congratulations.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah.
Well, Rod Stewart, here we finally are talking about the man, the mimic, the legend.
Well done.
I don't want to call him a mimic. He's a very soulful and original singer. But people might not be aware of that. You know, this album came out on Mercury in 1972. Yet, you guys remember our season 4 kickoff where we covered some classic albums released in 1972, as that was 50 years since 1972 at the time, and we listed off a whole bunch of legendary albums that were released that year, and did not mention this one. I mean, Rod Stewart is often overlooked or written off by rock and roll fans due to his mid-career shift towards pop and adult contemporary music. The general perception of him is that he's inauthentic or cheesy, but I think it's not very well known that his early solo albums and releases with the Faces are just they're about as authentic as raw mainstream rock and roll of that era got, the late 60s, early 70s.
Show him, Peter.
Should we just get into a selection before we say any more?
Yeah, show him what Rod's about.
Okay. So we're going to go with what was the biggest hit off of this release. Once again, Rod Stewart, Never a Dull Moment. The song is You Wear It Well, Side B, track 3.
Hot afternoon, but to settle down and write you a line. I've been meaning to phone you, but from Minnesota, hell, it's been a very long time. You wear it well, a little old-fashioned, but that's alright. Well, I suppose you're thinking, I bet he's sinking, or he wouldn't get in touch with me. Oh, I ain't begging or losing my head. I sure do want you to know that you wear it well. There ain't a lady in the land so fine. Oh my. Remember them baseball parties, your brother's karate, the all-day rock and roll shows, them homesick blues and the radical blues. I haven't left a mark on you. You wear it well, a little out of time, but I don't mind. But I ain't forgetting that you were once mine, but I blew it without even trying. Now I'm eating my heart out, trying to get a letter through.
I, for many years, was largely only aware of the hits. Rod Stewart, I feel like for years people were telling me like, oh, you got to check out like Faces and the early stuff. And I was like, yeah, I'll get around to that. But would just think of like, do you think I'm sexy? And like, I don't want to hear it. Or the kind of unnerving song Maggie May. But yeah, as you can hear there, he's rocking. And the first thing that comes to mind to me is like prime Rolling Stones. It feels in a similar vein there. And there's good reason for that, I found out.
Yeah, a lot of connections, and a very specific connection.
Yeah, and I love that mix of the acoustic instruments with that still very nasty, distorted electric guitar, and yet they just kind of blend so naturally in a way that seems like it shouldn't make sense.
It's kind of, I feel like his voice is that. It's like they build out the universe that is his voice, where it's like gravelly and harsh, but also kind of warm and like inviting somehow at the same time.
Yeah, very soulful. It does kind of tie all the elements together like that.
So this is Rod's fourth solo album, and this was the follow-up, his solo follow-up anyway, to the international success of the aforementioned Maggie May and its accompanying album Every Picture Tells a Story. And that song actually seems like an attempt to replicate the feel of Maggie May. It was co-written by British guitarist Martin Quintenton, who had also co-written Maggie May with Stewart, and it proved a success. The formula worked again. It hit number 1 in the UK and number 13 on the US Hot 100. It was actually my wife, Ellen, who got me into this album. She found this album through the podcast No Dogs in Space. Are either of you familiar with that podcast?
Yeah, they did a great series on the Velvet Underground and a good series on suicide, too, I remember.
Yeah, they do these deep dives that are several episodes long, and they did one on the Replacements a few years ago, and it was mentioned in that series that this album specifically was an influence on Paul Westerberg, the chief songwriter of the Replacements. I guess it was apparently the first album he ever bought, and he always considered it to be the gold standard he was shooting for. I found a 1990 interview where Paul Westerberg said it was nearly impossible to achieve that anymore because engineers are always turning that reverb knob when you're not looking, and this album is dry. He said that's what makes it sound so cool. It is worth mentioning now that Rod Stewart produced this album. On the No Dogs in Space podcast, the hosts really advocated for giving Rod Stewart an earnest chance, another chance, so Ellen did. She spent more time with this album than I have, and so she helped me pick the selections. What's your guys' Rod Stewart experience?
I have a similar history to what Jeremy had said before. I kind of just wrote him off for a long time. I didn't really hate him, but the hits that I knew kind of just never really did it for me. And I had, kind of an impression that maybe he was a little bit less authentic than the other guys like you talked about. I had listened to some of the Faces, especially after, watching the movie Rushmore. They used the Faces song Ooh La La in the ending. And I was like, man, that's a great song. Oh, it's the Faces. Maybe there's something to Rod Stewart. But for some reason, I just still took a very long time to go beyond that. And I think you had recommended him to me a little while ago. And it's just within the last few months that I started picking up some of these early solo albums and have been just very impressed, kind of blown away. In fact, there's a few of these albums that are nearly perfect in my opinion.
Yeah, apparently we've been doing a little dance around Rod Stewart for many years now, Sean, because prior to Ellen introducing me to this album, I was mostly familiar with his work with the Faces, which you were the one that got me to pick up a copy of Ooh La La, their final album.
Mm-hmm.
That was what made me think, oh, this early stuff that Rod Stewart did is great. And I picked up a copy of his self-titled debut, which in the UK is called An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down. And that's mostly where I was at with him, his work with the Faces and that very first solo album. How about you, Jeremy?
Well, my breakthrough with Rod came, it was about 2 years ago. Me and a friend of mine were out disc golfing. Very bro-y, I know. He's like a Dylan obsessive person who loves Neil Young and anybody who's a big lyrical person he's really into. He just started talking about this album, Never a Dull Moment, and was advocating for it strongly, and I found it confusing with my personal image of Rod Stewart. And then I checked it out, ended up picking up a copy myself. It's kind of the only one I've spent much time with, though. I really need to expand out into the other early albums, but this one, there really is something to it.
Yeah, it's, if not a perfect album, it's near perfect. It's close. It's a close call, I would say.
And I do love that we're kind of in our wheelhouse here, sticking with our long tradition of covering albums that are the follow-up to unexpected success and just seeing, did it work? What did they try to do? Is it a departure? Did they try and replicate it? And this one, pretty successful. I will say, when you look up reviews of this, you still get a lot of people generally kind of going with the take of, yeah, it's good, but it's just a shadow of the album that came before it. And, a lot of people talk about the song You Wear It Well being just kind of a rewrite of Maggie May, but Personally, I would much rather listening to You Wear It Well than Maggie May, but
yeah, I would agree that it kind of follows the formula of Maggie May, but I think overall it's actually a better song to me.
yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Well, do you guys, obviously we can't cover Rod Stewart's entire career here on this episode. That would take a multi-part series, and we very well could come back to other eras of his career. There's several stages throughout his career, but I was thinking we could get into some bio and learn how he got to this point in his career. How does that sound to the two of you?
Sounds great.
Let's hear about Sir Roderick.
Yeah. So, yes, Roderick David Stewart was born near the end of World War II on January 10th, 1945, so he just turned 80 years old. He was born in Highgate, London, the youngest of 5 children. Germany was actively bombing London at the time of his birth, and his family were frequently taking cover in a bomb shelter. The Stewarts were a working-class family, and like any respectable English family, they were huge fans of football, aka soccer. The young Stewart was particularly adept at the sport and became captain of his school football team and left school by age 15 with the ambition to become a professional footballer. Here we have another I'd buy that all-star, guys.
Yeah, we're getting quite a collection going.
We got quite the team here. He went as far as trials at a third-tier team of the English Football League in Brentford in 1960, but was never called back after trials. The year before, his father had bought him a guitar after Rod had shown an interest in rock and roll artists like Bill Haley and the Comets and Little Richard, although he had developed his love of singing and performing at a young age from Al Jolson, whose entire family were fans of Al Jolson. Coming to understand that he had a strong singing voice, a young Rod decided that music seemed a good career alternative to sports, and he could party down, which he would not be able to do as an athlete. So for the next few years, while still a teenager, he lived very much like a nomadic beatnik, inspired by left-wing politics. He would participate in protests and sit-ins for nuclear disarmament, and he wandered around England and even Europe, learning the harmonica, busking, sleeping under bridges, and performing with musical groups and touring when he could get work. He would return home as needed and worked a series of odd jobs, such as at his family news agency shop. He worked as a newspaper delivery boy, a fence erector, a sign writer, and a laborer at a cemetery, which was often blown out of proportion that he was a grave digger. This was actually something that Rod perpetuated,
As he is wont to do.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of rumors and myths surrounding Rod Stewart. I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with those, but Rod has set the record straight in more recent years that he simply took measurements for the plots at the cemetery and only briefly worked the job for a few weekends or something to that effect. There's also rumors that he was a member of the Ray Davies Quartet, a pre-Kinks outfit with a few of the eventual members of the band. He had gone to school with them, but Rod said he doesn't remember ever being in a band with them. Accounts vary from him being considered or auditioning for the group to briefly being a member, but the truth seems lost to time, as the best rock and roll legends go.
Yeah. A genre built on myth.
Yeah. He would change his style, his fashion style, from unkempt beatnik to a stylish mod with his trademark spiky rooster hairstyle, which he achieved with either sugar water or his sister's hair lacquer. And when he and Ron Wood eventually met and began performing together, one of the things they bonded over was A, their similar noses, and B, their similar hairstyles. And that's an important partnership which we'll talk more about how that came to be. But how about we just listen to a song that was co-written by Rod Stewart and Ron Wood?
Let's do it.
So we're going to listen to Italian Girls, which is side A, track 4.
17. Well, she claims she was a killer and she owned a floodlit villa a little out of ways from the main highway. Oh, take me way down yonder. She was tall, thin and tawny, and she drove a Maserati faster than sound. I was heaven bound, although I must have looked a creep in my army surplus Jeep. Was I being too bold before the night could get old? No, 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 no. She put me so wrong.
I love how that song just kind of seems to stumble together at the beginning. Like it's a little sloppy, and then the elements just kind of seem to gel together, and then before you know, it's just like this perfect song that you're listening to.
Yeah,
Yeah, it gives you that sense of like the musicians in the room and
Mhm.
one of them starts doing some and the other one kind of looks over and is like, yeah, man, and adds his thing. And yeah.
absolutely. I got some serious Exile on Main Street era Stones from the feeling of that song with that piano in there.
Yeah, my favorite Stones album, so it makes sense why this stuff is clicking real hard for me lately.
Yeah, and that was released near the end of the recording sessions for this album, and I think it's very possible that Rod and Ron Wood would have been privy to what the Stones were, would be paying attention to what the Stones were doing while they were working on this album. So I wouldn't doubt that there could have been some influence there. Well, should we get back to how Rod got here?
Yes.
So his big break in music came in January 1964 when he encountered Long John Baldry, who was a popular English blues bandleader. Long John Baldry overheard Rod performing blues harmonica on a train platform and invited him to sit in with his band.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the whole harmonica thing. I think we've been doing this podcast about 5+ years now, and we've never encountered an artist before where that was their introduction to performing or playing music, busking with a harmonica.
Yeah, that's different than singing in church or hearing the Beatles for the first time.
Yeah, he didn't labor away in music school.
There is a tie with him and the Beatles, though.
What is it?
Apparently, before this, in 1961, Rod Stewart and a band he was playing with got to go audition for Joe Meek, the super famous producer. And when Joe heard Rod sing, he put his fingers in his ears and just yelled until Rod stopped. And then he had Rod leave, and then he recorded Night of the Vampire with his band.
With that minus Rod?
Minus Rod, which the tie there being Joe Meek also turned down the Beatles because he didn't like what they were doing.
Yeah, Joe Meek was an eccentric guy, and Rod Stewart's voice did seem to, I guess just like maybe Janis Joplin, certain people would hear it and it would grate on them, but obviously I think history has shown that the majority of people find Rod Stewart's voice pleasing.
I had read that story, and the version I read said that Joe Meek had just made a rude sound. I was like, what was the sound? What was so rude about it?
Yeah, I saw a couple versions. One said he screamed until Rod left.
Well, I'd say there's as many rumors and legends around Joe Meek as there are around Rod Stewart. Which
Perfect clashing into one story.
Yeah. So within a couple nights of Rod sitting in with Long John Baldry's band, Baldry became aware of the voice that Rod possessed and officially hired him. And he had the 19-year-old. It's worth pointing out that Rod, he's been at it for a few years at this point. You mentioned that was a 1961 session. You were just mentioning, Jeremy, that he would have been 16 at that time. He's now 19 in 1964. Baldry had the 19-year-old sing lead on 2 or 3 songs with his band, the Hoochie Coochie Men, before Baldry made his entrance, and Rod became known as Rod the Mod. That's how he was billed, Rod the Mod.
So cool.
Yeah, so hip. He quickly made an impression on audiences, and by the fall of 1964, he had his own deal with Decca Records, but his debut single sadly failed to chart, and he left the Hoochie Coochie Men after a disagreement or a row with Baldry, and that band disbanded soon thereafter. By 1965, Baldry and Stewart had patched things up, and they teamed up again, this time with organist Brian Auger and vocalist Julie Driscoll, to form the band Steam Packet. And they were soon in the spotlight as the opening act for the Rolling Stones on a 1965 British tour, and then they also toured opening for the Walker Brothers. However, the members of Steam Packet were all on different labels with contracts that prevented them from commercially releasing recordings together, so the group was short-lived. Stewart then found himself in a similar outfit called Shotgun Express with future Fleetwood Mac members Mick Fleetwood and Peter Green. The group only released one unsuccessful single before disbanding, and Mick Fleetwood says Stewart was so concerned with always looking his best that he would discourage the band from loading or unloading their gear if it was even raining slightly outside. And he did this under the guise of not wanting to ruin the band's equipment, but in actuality not wanting to compromise his suit or hair. And so as the singer, he became responsible solely for loading and unloading the microphone. I also read that Rod Stewart would have to hold his hands in front of his spiked backcombed hair to protect it from the high winds at London train stations. Very concerned with his image. Which, interestingly, you guys may have come across this. He was also reportedly quite shy.
Yeah, like I'd read that was a big thing he had to overcome to perform on stage regularly and develop the persona that we know today.
Yeah, a showman, but maybe introverted underneath it all. That's Freddie Mercury is, one of the greatest showmen in history, and he was quite introverted in his personal life.
Yeah, definitely not uncommon.
So Rod's really big break came in 1967, now age 22, when former Yardbirds guitarist Jeff Beck asked him to join a Chicago blues-style band he was forming that would include bassist Ron Wood. And so, yeah, Rod Stewart and Ron Wood connected as basically as brothers. They formed a lifelong friendship and musical partnership. They did 2 albums with the Jeff Beck group and were scheduled to perform at Woodstock, but I think it was the night before they played, Jeff Beck flew back to the UK after hearing a rumor that his wife was having an affair with their gardener, which turned out to be false. And
Whoa.
This effectively broke up that lineup of the Jeff Beck group.
It's wild how many artists almost were at Woodstock and then accidentally ended up being at Woodstock, and wild.
Yeah, and it's funny because Rod said at the time they had already played several other U.S. festivals leading up to that summer. So they were tired and glad to just go home, it sounds like. It wasn't until the Woodstock movie came out that it really cemented as the big cultural event in pop culture memory and history that we now know it to be. Ron Wood hooked up with former members of the UK mod band Small Faces, who had just lost lead singer Steve Marriott. He had left to form Humble Pie. Of course, Ron Wood was convinced that Rod Stewart was the right replacement, which seems a no-brainer, but the band took some convincing. And I think that they said, they just didn't want to get into a situation. I guess Steve Marriott had been a bit of a prima donna, and they were just hesitant to bring in another singer into the fold. But ultimately, of course, Rod Stewart did join the group, and the new iteration was known as simply the Faces. And they performed rowdy, drunken rock and roll, legendarily messy, sloppy, drunken, but fun and somehow solid live shows. But simultaneously, Rod had committed to a solo career with Mercury Records and began releasing more folky albums under his own name. And these increasingly gained him attention in the US in particular. We mentioned before, Stewart became a superstar with the number one hit in the US, UK, and Canada, Maggie May, which was on his third studio album, Every Picture Tells a Story. And as you can imagine, this caused some tension in the Faces, as not only was it not one of their songs, but they were now being billed at a lot of the venues they played at, they were being billed as Rod Stewart and the Faces.
People don't like that.
No, it did propel sales of the Faces albums. Their next release, A Nod is as Good as a Wink to a Blind Horse, was released in the wake of the success of Maggie May in late 1971 and sold very well. This solo album followed in the summer of 1972. And next, I would like to play the opening song on Rod Stewart's Never a Dull Moment, because it's actually a Faces recording that ended up getting put on a Rod Stewart solo album. So that is True Blue, co-written again with Ron Wood, Side A, track 1.
Never been a millionaire, and I tell you, mama, I don't care. Never gonna own a racehorse or a fastback mid-engine Porsche. Don't think I'll own a private jet on the stock exchange. I'm no threat. So won't you help me make up my mind? Don't you think I better get myself back home? Oh yeah. Sitting in the moonlight glow. Excuse me if my feelings show. Watching all the trucks roll by, dreaming up an alibi. You see, back home I'm considered the fool, but maybe they're right, I don't know. So can't you help me make up my mind? Don't you think I better get myself back home? Who cares? Daddy says he'll buy me a car to drive just as far as I need. He wants me back at any expense. He's got a lot more money than sense. Funny, but now that I've gone, they all wanna be concerned. Oh, please, can you make up my mind? Don't you think I better get myself back home? Just don't know what to do. Oh, yeah.
It's a very interesting song to open up your follow-up to the Surprise Success album.
Yeah, it's kind of a song about experiencing surprise success and the internal conflict that goes with it. You know, feels like he just wants to go back home.
Yeah, it feels a little confessional
Mm-hmm.
and kind of coming to grips with how life has changed.
Well, yeah, and he's been, you know, a struggling musician for a while, or a working musician with, you know, moderate to low success. So, like, yeah, it was a shocking change, I'm sure.
Yeah, he had really been slugging it out for about a decade by the point that he finally had, massive superstar status.
Yeah, I think this song really captures too, like how good with words he is. I mean, I did notice he like idolized Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan coming up, and he does a Bob Dylan song actually on this album. Yeah, he's his lyricism, I think, is surprisingly strong throughout this album, and especially in this song.
Yeah, it's not something that I'm sure plenty of people have given him credit for his voice, but I've never really heard much mention of what a great lyricist he is. He deserves a little respect there.
Yeah.
Little recognition. As I mentioned, that is effectively a Faces recording that ended up on a Rod Stewart solo album. You have Ronnie Lane on bass, Kenny Jones on drums, Ian McClagan on organ and piano, Ron Wood on guitar. It was engineered by Glyn Johns. Ron Wood is, of course, all over this album on acoustic and electric guitars. Ronnie Lane from the Faces appears on bass on a few other songs aside from the one we just listened to. The co-writer of You Wear It Well, as well as Maggie May, Martin Quintenton, he lends acoustic guitar to a few songs. Mickey Waller, who had worked with Stewart in Steam Packet and the Jeff Beck Group, is on drums on all but True Blue. Pete Sears, who would soon join Jefferson Starship, is on piano and bass on a couple tracks. That's just a few of the players. You know, this album, it is, as we kind of said, it's the follow-up to the big successful album, and a lot of people in the know cite this as one of his best works. But I think it deserves more attention. I think it's one of the great albums of 1972, one of the great rock albums of that year, and really of the 70s. I would go so far as to say it's one of the great rock albums of the 70s.
I'd have to agree. It's pretty darn good.
I think the All Music review by Stephen Thomas Erlewine said that he never quite got this good again. But I'm willing to, and this is as far as I've gone into his catalog, as far as listening to his albums front to back. But I'd be willing to give his later 70s albums another shot, kind of see where things start to veer off in other directions. And I think we could cover a whole lot more Rod Stewart. This is just scratching the surface. I think there's potentially, as we've promised another Peggy Lee episode, I think we could promise another Rod Stewart down the road.
I gotta say, every time I'm DJing with someone and they drop Rod Stewart's Do You Think I'm Sexy, I like it a little bit more. It kind of still works great played through a nice system real loud.
Yeah, I was so confused about who Rod Stewart was when I was first getting into popular music at around age 12, 13, because on the radio at the time, I think it was like an MTV Unplugged performance that he had done, a version of Reason to Believe by Tim Hardin that was all over the radio at the time. And I liked that song. And then the other song I knew by him was Do You Think I'm Sexy? Mm-hmm. And those songs were worlds apart. And for a long time, that's all I knew. For years, I feel like those were the two sides of Rod Stewart that I knew.
From what I gathered, he really departs when him and Ron Wood kind of depart in the mid-70s. The album after The Smiler is also a pretty good rockin' one. And then they kind of part ways and Faces breaks up. And that's kind of when Rod, he does the disco album and then he goes new wave and then like adult contemporary. It seems like he kind of gets unmoored. And I think there's probably a lot of importance to the partnership between him and Ronnie Wood in this era that kind of, made these albums how they are and as good as they are.
And since you teased it so early on, we should, if anyone doesn't know, we should probably mention that Ron Wood, or Ronnie Wood, he goes off after Faces breaks up to join
the Rolling Stones.
Yeah. So that's it seems that Rod Stewart is really connected with, in one way or another, with most of the UK rock musicians of the 60s, 70s. He seems to have found his way. He's sort of like, Chrissie Hynde, how we were saying how she was sort of all over the place as far as just having encountered nearly every important figure of a certain scene. I think Rod Stewart's very much that too.
Chrissy Hynde, another artist that sometimes plays harmonica.
Ooh.
Yeah, well, you are the expert on this.
Of course. Wrote a whole clickbait article about it.
Well, speaking of you being an expert on things, Sean, I hear tell that you're an expert on recommended similar albums.
You know, in all honesty, I am.
What did you bring for us this time?
I've got 4 recommended similar albums, one that we've featured on the show before and 3 others that maybe we will in the future. First up, Nils Lofgren and Grin, 1+1, 1972.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
You know, that one has a good mix of the rockin' sounds and the sweeter, more acoustic sounds, but also blends those two styles a little bit. It's hard to really replicate the kind of magic that Rod Stewart had going on this album in this time period, but you can find some satisfying similarities in that album, and it's a great episode as well.
It's kind of like the two elements sort of separated out a little more.
And one that maybe you wouldn't think of right away, but there's some definite influence and similarities. The Raspberries with their album Fresh from 1972, another follow-up to Success kind of album.
So that's the follow-up to, I'm guessing, whatever album Go All the Way was on?
Yes, the self-titled.
And that's Eric Carmen is the singer of the Raspberries.
Yes, and they were a group who were very influenced by the Small Faces as well as other early UK groups.
Yeah, well, that's Go All the Way is a classic. It's a kind of strange mix of Roy Orbison and arena rock.
Yeah, people will often kind of put them in like the power pop realm, which, I mean, some similarities to what Rod was doing on this for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Another one, this one's going, I guess, a little bit more obscure, but Delaney with his first solo album, Some Things Coming from 1972. That's Delaney of Delaney and Bonnie and Friends fame.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know much about what that all was, I have to be honest.
It's pretty good. It's often very rootsy. There's a lot of gospel influence going on with just a lot of that, rock and roll of the time period. But it's very interesting music, and I really like that first solo album he did. I feel like I don't really ever hear people talking about it, but there's some excellent material on there.
That's that's something I've heard a whole lot about and really know nothing about. So maybe I'll start there, Sean.
Maybe. One final bonus 4th suggestion, Joe Cocker's self-titled album from 1972, featuring the song Woman to Woman, which was sampled in Tupac's California Love.
Yes. You somehow made a Tupac connection here.
Just for you.
I appreciate it. It's not easy work keeping up on the Tupac connections.
Yeah. But how do you guys feel about Joe Cocker? Are you guys fans?
I haven't spent a lot of time with him. I like the few things I know of his, but mainly, his Woodstock performance I'm familiar with, and
all the wild faces he was making during that performance.
Yeah.
John Belushi's impression.
Joe Cocker, another guy with a very soulful yet very polarizing voice.
Yeah, I don't dislike it. I like a lot of grit in my vocalists if it's the right song for it or the right style.
Yeah, I don't think we touched much on how soul definitely influenced Rod. We probably don't have time, but he does do a Sam Cooke song on this album, which is not what we're playing last.
Well, you've alluded to some of the covers. He does several on this album. He does Mama, You've Been on My Mind by Bob Dylan, I'd Rather Go Blind by Etta James, Twistin' the Night Away by Sam Cooke, and all of those are great renditions, but when my wife Ellen and I were talking about the songs to feature from this, she chose Rod Stewart's version of Angel originally written and recorded by Jimi Hendrix because it's the one that is enhanced the most from the original. So this was written, that's what we're going to go out on today. It was written by Jimi Hendrix about a dream that he had of his mother, Lucille, when he was a child, in which the imagery seemed to imply that she was being whisked away from him, and it proved prescient when she passed away a couple years later when Jimmy was just 15 years old. A version of this was included on Hendrix's first posthumous album, The Cry of Love, in 1970, which consisted of material he was working on for his fourth album. But Rod's version, it's just so soulful. I mean, Hendrix may be the greatest guitarist of all time, but he did not have Rod Stewart's voice. Rod doesn't hold back, but everything he does just seems so in service or of conveying the emotions expressed in this song. This was released as a single. It hit number 4 in the UK, but only cracked the top 40 at number 40 in the US. But it did have a little success as a single.
Yeah, you may not like Rod's, like the texture of his voice, but his delivery in this song, it's undeniable how good of a singer he is. This is a super hard song to sing. There's like that key modulation into the chorus that's like really hard to wrap your ear around if you're trying to sing it. Yeah, and his delivery is just powerful.
Yeah, the whole cover of this song is so great. Hendrix is one of my favorites, but I typically don't like hearing covers of his music because most of the time people really just don't get the energy right. They try and make it a little more sterile or like remove a little bit of that raw sloppiness. But, Rod keeps it fully intact with this record. Just really nails the soulful energy, but also that kind of reckless, raw rock and roll vibe.
Yeah, come to think of it, this may be the only Hendrix cover I've ever heard that I've liked, let alone loved.
Yeah, he's a hard artist to cover and have it still be interesting.
So we'll leave listeners with that. We, of course, thank you for spending some time with us here on I'd Buy That for $1. It is incredible that these Rod Stewart albums are still so cheap. Get them while you still can. Who knows if he's at the point that he's on his farewell tour right now. He's getting all throughout 2025. He's playing what are being billed as his final gigs.
Yeah, it's your last chance to see him ever until he decides to do a farewell tour part 2.
Yeah, which that has been known to happen. Artists have done that.
Yeah, but it could be your last chance, so maybe go see him.
Yeah, coming probably to a city near you very soon. All right, guys. Well, we have 2025 ahead of us. It's here. We're ready. Bring it on, 2025. We've got more records for you no matter what happens.
Is this the year where we finally run out of records to talk about, or do you think we're good for a while still?
I think if we're just getting a Rod Stewart, we're good for a while still.
I got a few in the chamber still.
Good deal. All right. Well, thank you again. I'm co-host Peter Cook.
I'm co-host Jeremy.
And I'm co-host Sean Hartman.
Fly on, Angel.
Angel came down from heaven yesterday. Stayed with me long enough to rescue me. And she told me a story yesterday about the sweet love between the moon and the deep blue sea.